I'm Shahar Azani, and welcome to this special episode of Eye on Israel. The Maccabee Task Force, MTF, was created in 2015 with the goal of combating the disturbing spread of antisemitism on college campuses and the boycott movement at the core of it. MTF helps students combat this trend of hatred by providing strategies and resources to help those students tell the truth, yes, it exists, about Israel. David Brog is the executive director of the Maccabee Task Force. He previously sat on the board of directors of Christians United for Israel, the famous CUFI, where he served as executive director for its first 10 years. Before CUFI, Brog worked in the United States Senate for 7 years, rising to be Chief of Staff to Senator Arlen Specter and Staff Director of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He's also worked as an executive at America Online and practiced corporate law in Tel Aviv, Israel, and Philadelphia. Brog is the author of Standing with Israel, Why Christians Support the Jewish State, In Defense of Faith, the Judeo-Christian Idea and the Struggle for Humanity, and Reclaiming Israel's History, Roots, Rights, and the Struggle for Peace. The Forward newspaper listed Brog in its Forward 50 most influential Jews in America. He is a graduate of Princeton University and Harvard Law School, and it's a great pleasure to have him with us. David, thank you for coming on JBS today.
It's great to be with you, Shahar. Thank you for having me.
So you're all the way out in Las Vegas.
Yeah, we moved here in 2015 to create the Maccabee Task Force. We reluctantly left Texas to come out here.
Right, and
it's become home.
It's become home, and you're mentioning the 2015, which is the famous meeting in the course of which MTF was established. I want to start, maybe ask you for the purpose of introduction and for our viewers. CUFI, the Maccabee Task Force, Israel, great advocate for truth and justice and the Jewish people. What propelled you to do who you are today?
Well, I think it's a similar story for a lot of us. I mean, I grew up in a typical suburban Jewish American household, very much identified as an American and an American only. But we had a connection to Judaism and Jewish history in our household. And it was enough of a basis that I remember the day in high school, we had to write a report on a biography or an autobiography. So I went to the library of Atlantic City High School and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I was looking for a book on John F. Kennedy. The book on John F. Kennedy had already been taken out. But I saw another book by a guy I heard of, a guy named Begin, who I remember reading about in the news. He was Prime Minister of Israel. And I ended up taking home The Revolt and reading The Revolt. And there's this display of passion for Jewish history and passion for Jewish survival and pride in being Jewish resonated with me like nothing before in my life ever had. And all of a sudden I realized I have another identity. Now, in addition to my American identity, I'm part of a people that's had a tremendous story, a very tragic story, but now with this beautiful new chapter of Israel. And I suddenly realized I could no longer be a bystander in this latest, most interesting chapter. Had to get involved, had to do something to ensure this project of Jewish survival and Jewish thriving continued, and did not, God forbid, meet with its end.
And here you are, standing at the helm of one of the most influential organizations supporting Israel, CUFI. How did that, Jewish identity led you to be at the leadership of CUFI, of all organizations, David?
Well, you mentioned I worked for Senator Arlen Specter, who was a senator from the state of Pennsylvania. And I love to quote Jim Carville, the political pundit, because he did a race in Pennsylvania once, and he summed it up beautifully. He said, Pennsylvania is a funny state. You have Philly in the east, Pittsburgh in the west, and Alabama in between. And what Cargill was referring to as Alabama is actually what Pennsylvanians call the T, central and northern Pennsylvania. That is unusually rural, unusually conservative, and unusually Christian for being situated in the northeast of the United States. And so when running for re-election, when Specter was running for re-election, I spent a lot of time in the T, met a lot of evangelical Christians. Many of them told me how much they loved Israel and the Jewish people, how much they loved me because I was Jewish. And this is back in the late 90s when our community was not familiar with evangelical love or evangelical support. And my reaction was typical of our community. I was skeptical of it. That didn't jive with my understanding of Jewish history and Christian lands. But But the more I got to know these people and the more I really fell in love with them, I grew ashamed of my skepticism. I realized in a sense I was doing unto evangelicals what Christians had done unto us for so many centuries. I was judging a faith I knew nothing about and coming to conclusions about it on the basis of rumor and innuendo, not fact. And I decided to do better. And I spent 3 years researching and writing a book simply to answer the question, why do evangelicals love Israel and the Jewish people? I concluded it's for the most noble of reasons. I concluded it's something extremely important that we in the Jewish community should recognize, appreciate, and embrace, not reject. And that led me to meeting one of the most prominent pro-Israel evangelicals in America, Pastor John Hagee in Texas. When he told me he had a dream of creating a Christian AIPAC and asked me if I'd be able to help him do that, I said, this is an exciting challenge. This is what I want to do. And I was employee number one of CUFI in 2006. We had 0 members, $0 in the bank. But I saw enormous potential with this organization and came to pass.
You know what I love the most about the path that you just described is it is one of hope, of creativity, of imagination, and great resilience in a time where too many, in my opinion, despair in the face of the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish machinery that is at work in this world. So kudos to you. This is truly inspirational to listen to this.
Well, thanks, Shahar. One of the reasons, by the way, and it's relevant to our conversation about the present day, one of the reasons I was so intrigued by evangelical support for Israel and wanted to understand it better is because it seemed to me to create the potential, give us a potential solution to a problem that was very clear to me. One of my jobs for Spectre was to be in touch with the conservative base in Pennsylvania. He needed to win Republican primaries, and for a variety of reasons, he wasn't always well loved by conservatives. So I was his conservative whisperer, and I was in close touch with the grassroots. And I saw some trends I didn't like when it came to support for Israel. This was a time when Pat Buchanan was building a big following on the right. Ron Paul was building a big following on the right. And they were starting to question our support for Israel, and I think overreact to mistakes that were made in Iraq. I was not a fan of the Iraq War. I was not a supporter of the Iraq War. But I always saw an enormous difference between a war like Iraq, where we sent American boys to fight and die on behalf of another country, and our support for an ally like Israel, which has only wanted to defend itself by itself and in the process defends our interests in the region.
Right.
A big distinction there that a lot of people on the right were not seeing and not acknowledging. And so I began to get worried about support for Israel on the right. Well, how do we solve that problem? Jews were not well situated to solve that problem. There are too few of us. Too many of us are Democrats. And too many of us are concentrated in a handful of coastal cities.
Right.
We could not be the source for a revival of support for Israel on the right. Evangelical Christians, however, were strong where we were weak, conservative where we were liberal, numerous where we were small, and represented geographically across the country.
And a great testament to your vision is the reality we see today with so many Christian organizations who support the state of Israel outwardly and conduct the same kind of advocacy that you envisioned.
Right. They were there. The love of Israel was there. They simply lacked an organization and a voice to make this support well known in the corridors of power in Washington. That's what Christians United for Israel and other groups have accomplished. Today, it's no longer misunderstood or unknown. It's well known, very well known. If you want to please an evangelical constituency, you'll express your support for Israel. Nothing summarized that better than the fact that when Donald Trump moved the embassy to Jerusalem, he acknowledged publicly this is something he did for his evangelical supporters, first and foremost.
Right. Can you imagine what an incredible move, promised for so many years and executed finally. What an incredible achievement it truly is. I have to ask you about the Maccabee Task Force. So you mentioned a 2015 founding meeting. What stood at the foundation of bringing the Maccabee Task Force to be?
It was the fact that Sheldon and Miriam Adelson understood something that our community as a whole did not fully understand at that time, which is The threat of BDS, and we speak about BDS as a shorthand. It doesn't. There are other tactics. It's the effort to demonize and delegitimize Israel on college campuses, right, as an effort to demonize and delegitimize Israel with the American public as a whole, right, was a serious effort gaining traction, and yet our community had done very little about it. You know, the average budget to do pro-Israel work on a college campus, excluding the richest campuses, excluding Harvard and Columbia. Average campus pro-Israel groups, Hillels, had maybe $10,000, $20,000 to do pro-Israel programming. The things you can do with that money almost never make a difference.
Right.
What are you going to do with that? You can bring a speaker to campus.
Right.
There may have been a day in America where people who disagreed would show up to hear a speaker from a different perspective and expand their understanding.
True.
Those days are long over. No one's going to come hear a pro-Israel speaker except people who are already pro-Israel. Maybe if you're lucky, a couple of anti-Israel people there to protest, not to listen.
Correct.
What else are you going to do? A falafel brunch and feed the pro-Israel community.
Right.
So they realized we had a problem in resources that led to a weakness in strategy. And so they said it's time the community step up and provide far larger resources to address a really significant problem. That's what the Maccabee Task Force was created to do. That's what it's done. And it put me in an interesting position. Usually when you're running a nonprofit, you have the solution. You know what you want to do.
Right.
And you have to go out and persuade donors to fund your vision. This was completely different. I had the funding and support through the Adelson family, but I didn't know what to do. It had been a long time since I'd been on a college campus, and I was acknowledged and owned my ignorance. By the way, not a bad way to start a new project.
By the way, what you just said, David, is the core of success, which is something I've continuously repeated. We don't have to know everything. We just have to acknowledge the fact that we don't know, which will be an incredible path for finding an answer. Kudos to you on this.
Thank you. Incredibly important. We don't know. We don't have to know. We often think we know more than we do know. And I think we can all benefit from saying, hey, you know what? I can learn. And I'll tell you what, the first 6 months I had a strategy that I wanted to pursue, that I funded primarily through lots of funding other outside groups. After 6 months, not a pleasant feeling. I had to go in and tell the Adelsons that I had not used their money effectively and that I wanted to start over again. And then I did something which proved helpful. I went to the stakeholders. I went to the people who were focused mostly on their campus and fighting the battle on their campuses. This would be the pro-Israel students on campus. Israel fellows sent as shlichim to the campuses. Hillel director focused on his campus. Chabad rabbi focused on his campus. I went and sat with the stakeholders and I said, if money were no object, what would you want to do or do more of to help promote Israel on your campus and fight the delegitimization of Israel? And we started with a pilot on 6 campuses in California. And what I found so encouraging was I got great ideas back from each of these campuses. And the great idea of each campus was different from the ones of the other campuses. So I could circle back and say to all 6, hey, here's a proposed action plan for the year with these 10 strategies. If you agree to do it and execute it, we'll agree to fund it. And we saw great success from that. We expanded the next year to 20 campuses, then to 40, then to 80, then to 100. We reached a maximum of 115.
Is that the number today?
We've now cut back to 100 this year, and I want to cut to 75 next year, and I'll explain why. But we kept experimenting. We kept using each campus as a laboratory in which to try new things to combat delegitimization and figure out what worked and what doesn't. And then eventually, over the years, we came to identify the core of our program, the thing that really works and really makes a difference. And it's pretty easy to summarize, but I'll tell you what it is and why it works so effectively. This is 90% of our budget and 90% of what we do. We work with our partners on these campuses to map the campus, figure out who are the 20 or so people who dominate campus politics. Usually it's no more than 20.
Right.
Get to know them, invite them on a trip to Israel. The second part of our strategy after recruitment is the trip to Israel for 20 campus leaders and influencers, typically not Jewish, who are accompanied by 5 pro-Israel students who are not there to enjoy Israel, but to own the relationships with these leaders and influencers. And then the follow-up, and when they get back, use each of these leaders as a bridge to their respective communities to build a larger coalition that can defend Israel on campus. This is critical because, as we were discussing earlier, everything's gotten siloized in America as a whole, and especially on campus. And tragically, if you inhabit what I would call a progressive left silo, woke left silo, the only students you meet are going to have that woke left worldview. Same for the social media you consume, same for the media you consume,
right.
Same for the professors that teach you.
Right.
And this is the insight that we have to understand and recognize. Being critical of Israel is not an exception to this silo. It is the rule. It is the default. Back when I was a student, there was a default of sympathy for Israel.
Right.
So if you wanted to do something anti-Israel, you had to do the hard work of picking off students, changing their minds, and cobbling together an anti-Israel coalition. Today, that is completely on 180 degrees the opposite. We're the ones who have to do the hard work of penetrating this ideological silo, cobbling together a coalition, and defending Israel from the onslaught. And the only way to do this, the only way to penetrate that silo and get people to pay attention to Israel long enough to get them to understand the anti-Israel narrative they've been fed is a lie, is by bringing them to Israel and letting them see it for themselves. Nothing else that I've done and I've experienced seems to work, because they're not going to come hear your speaker.
David, I have to ask you something that I'm sure a lot of our viewers are asking. There are a lot of organizations out there, even in 2015 there were, who do different work on campus, bring people to Israel. What sets MTF apart? Why did you feel there was a need for another entity?
What we were doing was not happening then anywhere, with one exception. And that exception was UCLA, one of our first 6 schools. They had done a trip like this. Again, there had been groups that they brought like 3 people from one campus and 3 from another. They'd have a trip for 30 people from 10 different campuses. That existed. That's not enough to change any of those 10 campuses. We need to shift fundamentally the thinking of the political leaders and influencers on a campus. 3 is not critical mass. 20 is critical mass. So the only people doing a campus-specific trip, not for Jewish students, but for campus leaders and political influencers, was UCLA. And they told us they had done it, but they were having a hard time raising the funds to do it a second time. And they suggested to us, that's what we'd like to do if money were no object. We said, that's a great idea. Let's try it. We funded it at UCLA and the other 5 campuses in our first year. And it worked so well, better than I would have envisioned or imagined, because I thought it would be much harder to persuade students in this woke ecosystem to be sympathetic to Israel. It worked so well, we expanded it. So we offer a bus to each one of our 100 campuses. And we don't just give them the idea, hey guys, go bring a bus. We pay for it. Incredible. It ain't cheap. It's $110,000 that we give to the campus. That idea, and more importantly, the funding for it just wasn't there before the Maccabees and the generosity of our donors, the Adelson family.
David, we already understood in a very short time that we have the kind of creative, out-of-the-box thinking we're witnessing here. So truly inspirational, and thank you for that. Your op-ed in the Jewish Journal recently talking about the Hindu-Jewish alliance seems to be another element of trailblazing of the David Brog manufactory in this direction. Share with us a little bit about that vision.
So basically, this is something I've been looking for, right? When we had the problem on the right, we needed to find other communities with clout on the right who could join our pro-Israel coalition and make sure the base of the Republican Party remained pro-Israel. Today, we face that same problem, not on the right, but on the left. I think because of the work of Kufi and other groups, we are safe on the right for at least a generation, which is as good as it ever gets in this game.
Right.
On the left, it's not an emergency. The house isn't on fire. I think many can argue the house is burnt down. We're facing a serious problem when it comes to support for Israel, when it comes to the base of the Democratic Party, the activist base, the young people. And a lot of people will respond to that and say, well, wait a minute, Joe Biden's pro-Israel, Nancy Pelosi is pro-Israel. It's true. But when they are getting up there in years, when you look at where the energy is, in the Democratic Party, the young people on the base, they're almost universally critical of Israel. Right. And again, there are exceptions like Richie Torres, who's wonderful, but there are too few of them.
Like you said before, that's not the rule, that's the exception to the rule.
It's the exception. So when I say this, I'm criticized as being partisan. I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm just trying to be objective.
Focused.
And focused on where our challenge is today.
Right.
It doesn't mean there's not anti-Semitism on the right. It doesn't mean there won't be but where is the crux of the problem politically today? It's on the left. So if we want to succeed on the left, we need to find allies. We need to find partners to help us get over the fact that A, we're a small community, and B, in this current environment, we're a community that is easily marginalized by people on the woke left, by claiming that we are white and therefore are unable to speak to so many issues at the heart of the agenda of the left. So when it comes to this, I was struck by how similar other immigrant communities are, primarily the Hindu American community. Because just like us, and this plays out both in domestic policy and foreign policy, but when it comes to domestic policy, just like us, the Hindu American story is one of working hard and getting ahead. A lot of Indian Americans get hotshot jobs in high tech, but most of them came here, and just like my parents' generation, they opened stores and motels and worked hard so their children could go to college and become professionals. It was our story, and a generation later, it is their story. Well, that does something for you. One, and by the way, they were marginalized. They were discriminated against because they were not perceived as being white, just like we, a generation earlier, were marginalized and discriminated against because we were not perceived as being white. So this creates something in the community. One, an opposition to all forms of discrimination on the basis of race, skin color, national origin that is deep and personal. But two, a devotion to the meritocracy that enabled us to overcome the discrimination we faced and succeed so dramatically in America. Right. This marriage of an opposition to real discrimination, real hate, real racism, but a love of the meritocracy that enabled our success and is foundational to the American dream. That's the combination we need if we're ever going to push back and prevail against this exaggerated effort that we see from the woke left to dismantle the meritocracy and return to judging people just by color, just by national origin, and not by these other elements of our character. So on the domestic front, we have this identity of experience that leads to an identity of approach. And then when it comes to foreign policy, and this is something we don't have in common with every other immigrant group, Indians are connected, Hindu Americans are connected to India in the way we're connected to Israel. And just like Israel is not safe and needs our support and needs our help, India is not perceived by them as safe and needs their help and needs their support. We both confront the threat from militant Islam, and we both confront on our borders enemies that are also enemies of America. In the case of Israel, it's Iran, and in the case of India, it's China. And the last piece is both of our countries to which we're so deeply connected are countries that are now coming under increasing scrutiny and criticism from the same left. And so just like they'll view Israel in some one-dimensional way in which Israel is evil and responsible for the conflict, we're now seeing increasingly attacks on India as being an occupier of Kashmir and responsible for its conflicts. And so we have the same love for the motherland, the birthplace of our peoples and our faiths, and the same opposition to our countries from certain elements within the American political spectrum. And so this unites us both on foreign policy and domestic policy that in a way that really necessitates our coming together on these things.
Since we're reaching the end of the show, which I can't believe it's my terrible tragedy because I could talk to you for hours about this, I want to ask you for the source of your energy, because a lot of people fall into despair out there today, thinking about the anti-Israel, anti-Jewish machinery that exists there, and here you are exuding wonderful, positive creativity and energy and thinking about new pathways and new alliances. What would you recommend those viewers out there who are listening to you and want to be infected with that highly contagious and beautiful energy that you show on this path? What can we do to stand up for Israel in a creative way?
Well, first, I recommend they listen to you and your show because I love your energy and your enthusiasm, Shahar, and it's been a real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
But I think we all we need to remember the old Passover saying is true. In every generation, an enemy comes against us, and the Jewish people have prevailed, not because we run in terror, but because we stand our ground. And with intelligence, we scan the horizon and figure out how we're going to survive this challenge. And so we got to get used to it. We got to get used to this idea that every generation there's a new threat, and there's never peace for that much longer. And that impacts your mindset and discourages getting too discouraged. But the last thing I'll say, I recently read a great biography of Theodore Herzl, and boy, if you ever feel yourself discouraged or down, you can read a biography of Theodore Herzl. What he went through, almost as a lonely, singular figure to create and fuel the Zionist movement. As he's organizing these historic Zionist conferences, he has to worry about pleasing his bosses at the newspaper back in Vienna who don't like the fact that his output in articles has diminished. Everything he went through and just stuck with his dream and his vision. Boy, compared to that, I think we all have it pretty good these days.
For me, on my end, I always say that looking into our thousands of years of history, we live at a time when we have a thriving, prosperous, strong state of Israel, and that is in and of itself a great reason to stand up for it, like all of our forefathers who wish they could have been where we are. So no matter what dark forces we face, the ability to carry the light is ours, and this is our privilege and fortune to be alive in this generation. Don't you think, David?
That's really well said. That's really well said. If we don't, we just celebrated the 75th Yom Ha'atzmaut. If we can't appreciate the miracle that we are blessed to witness and be a part of, you're really lacking in vision and lacking in understanding. That's absolutely true.
So I'm not going to ask you, because from listening to you, I already know you're optimistic about the future. And to be honest, listening to you, so am I.
I really appreciate it, Shahar. It's really great to speak to you and get to feed off of your energy.
Right. From David, I'll give you my takeaway from this interview, and there is so much, but one core thing that you said that I think should resonate with everyone is the necessary humility in facing challenges, to understand that we do not know and go and seek the answer before we act upon our gut instincts. That move to go and listen to others, I think would benefit so many on a variety of levels for a variety of causes, but we're lucky that you got to do it for the Jewish people in Israel. Thank you so much for sharing these incredible insights. I don't know about you, but I'm sure that I and our viewers have learned so much from all that you do for Israel and for the Jewish people, and in general for the pro-Israel, pro-truth alliance in the United States and around the world. Toda Rabba. Thank you so much for that, David.
And Badma, it was good to be with you. Thanks, Shahar.
And we wish David much luck on those endeavors. It was truly wonderful to listen to these words of inspiration, especially in this time, just celebrating Israel's 75th anniversary. And to our viewers, I want you to remember, we encounter too many, who sometimes despair in the course of the fight for hearts and minds for Israel. What we've learned from the conversation with David, it clearly illustrates that there is no room for such despair. Israel has so much within it, and there are so many creative and wonderful ways to tell Israel's story and the Jewish people's inspirational story. If only we put our minds to it creatively, filled with hope and the ability to listen. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and looking forward to seeing you all next time as we cast another fascinating, if I may add, eye on Israel.